A broke Ranger veteran, Damian Foster, uses his last dollar on a remote, dilapidated cabin. He shoves the door open, and immediately a shotgun is shoved in his face. The woman holding it is Vanessa, a pregnant stranger, trembling but desperate. Damian's canine chief reacts in a split second. He launches forward, a blur of fur and teeth, every muscle taut, ready to tear the threat apart. But then, the unthinkable happens. When Vanessa lowers the gun, Chief stops cold. The savage growl dies in his throat, replaced by a confused whine. He ignores Damian, moves closer, and nudges his head into the woman's hand. Damian is frozen. His canine, loyal only to him, why is he comforting the stranger who just threatened his life? He takes a hard look at the old flannel shirt she's wearing, and his entire world falls apart. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The old pickup's engine groaned, a strained metallic complaint as it hauled the weight of a life reduced to a 10-foot trailer. The tires spun in the mud of what the county auction map had optimistically called a road, but which was really just two deep ruts carved through the endless pine forest of the Idaho Panhandle. Inside the cab, Damian Foster gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. At 40, he wore the last 3 months like a decade of hard living. His brown hair, once kept high and tight in the Ranger tradition, was now overly long, and the gray invading his temples had begun a rapid march across his scalp. His face, lean and weathered, was set in a mask of tense exhaustion, the lines around his eyes betraying a sleeplessness that went bone deep. He hadn't really slept since James. Beside him, silent and watchful, sat Chief. The dog was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, but his coloring was more wolf than standard breed, a striking, beautiful mix of silver gray and white fur. He was a big animal, heavy-boned and powerful, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a professional. A retired canine, Chief was intensely loyal, but reserved. He didn't offer sloppy kisses or demand attention. His devotion was a quiet, steady presence, a shared understanding forged during long nights on patrol and cemented in the empty silence that followed their return to civilian life. Damian's gaze flickered from the muddy track to the dog. "Almost there, buddy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Chief's ears twitched, but his eyes remained fixed on the trees ahead. He was always on watch. The rattling hitch of the U-Haul trailer was a constant, agonizing reminder of his failure. Everything Damian Foster owned was in that box. His tools, his clothes, the few photos he'd salvaged, and the folded American flag from his father's funeral. The company, Foster Brothers Construction, was gone, devoured by lawyers and creditors in a matter of weeks. The bankruptcy hadn't been a single event, but a slow, crushing collapse. It had all started the day James died, 3 months ago. Damian's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. The official report had called it accidental, a single-car crash on a clear night. His younger brother, his only family, gone. James the optimist, the one who handled the books and charmed the clients while Damian built the houses. After the funeral, Damian had tried to keep the business afloat, but the grief was a fog and the numbers never added up. He found discrepancies, strange withdrawals, angry clients he'd never heard of. It turned out James, his cheerful, seemingly irresponsible brother, had been the one holding it all together. Without him, the whole structure crumbled. This cabin, bought sight unseen from a county foreclosure auction, was the end of the line. It was the last of his money, a desperate gamble on a fresh start, a place so remote that the ghosts of his past might finally give him peace, a place to rebuild, or maybe just a place to stop falling. The truck crested a final rise, and the trail opened into a small, overgrown clearing. He turned the key, and the engine's labored rumble died, leaving a profound, unsettling silence. "This is it," Damian said, more to himself than to the dog. He stared through the windshield, his hope shriveling into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The grainy 10-year-old photo online had shown a rustic, charming log cabin. The reality was a nightmare. It wasn't a fixer-upper. It was a ruin. The structure was dilapidated, rotting back into the earth. The porch roof sagged at a drunken angle, held up by little more than memory. The siding, where it wasn't missing entirely, was warped and gray, covered in a diseased-looking green moss. One of the front windows was a jagged, empty hole, stuffed with a plastic garbage bag that flapped weakly in the cold autumn breeze. A wave of overwhelming, bitter disappointment washed over Damien. He had failed again. He had spent his last dollar on a pile of rotten wood. He sat there for a long minute, the cab of the truck feeling like the only solid place left in the world. He closed his eyes, his training as a ranger screaming at him to assess, adapt, and overcome. But the civilian in him just wanted to put the truck in reverse and drive until the gas ran out. He let out a long, shaky breath and reached for the door handle. Well, let's see the damage. The truck door groaned in protest as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. He swung his legs out, his worn combat boots sinking into the soft mud. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He turned to let Chief out. "Okay, boy, come on." Chief didn't move. Damien whistled softly, the sharp two-note command they had used for years. The dog remained rigid, perfectly still on the bench seat. A low, barely audible vibration started deep in his chest. It wasn't a bark, but a rumble of profound distrust. Damien froze. He knew that sound. "Chief, what is it?" He watched his dog, the fur along Chief's spine, the heavy hackles from his shoulders to his tail, slowly stood on end. The dog's head was lowered, his intelligent eyes locked on the cabin, his black nose twitching as he tasted the air. He wasn't looking at the broken window or the sagging porch. He was assessing. In all their years, first in service and then in the quiet desperation of the last few months, Damien had learned to trust the dog's instincts implicitly. Chief was not a nervous animal. He was a trained canine. He signaled threats. He didn't invent them. Damien slowly, quietly, moved his hand from the truck door and let it rest near his hip, where his service pistol used to be. A useless reflex. He was unarmed. "What do you see, buddy?" he whispered. His own senses kicked in, the dormant ranger training pushing through the fog of his depression. He scanned the tree line. He checked the overgrown bushes. Nothing, no movement, no sound but the wind in the pines. He looked back at Chief. The dog hadn't moved, but his low growl had intensified, becoming a clear, definite warning. He was standing defensively, ready to place himself between Damien and whatever was in that cabin. Damien followed the dog's intense gaze, not at the door, not at the dark, empty-looking windows, but higher, at the chimney. From the crumbling stack of river stones, a pale, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled into the gray Idaho sky. Damien's heart hammered against his ribs. The cabin wasn't empty. Someone was burning his firewood, living in his cabin, trespassing on the last place on earth he had left to call his own. The silence in the clearing was absolute, broken only by the wind whispering through the pines and the low, steady rumble in Chief's chest. Damien's hand, which had been resting on the truck's door, instinctively moved to his hip, his fingers closing around empty air. The phantom weight of his service weapon was a feeling he'd never quite lost. He forced his hand open, flexing his fingers. First, control the animal. "Chief, quiet." His voice was a low command, barely more than a breath. The dog's growl didn't stop, but it subsided, dropping to a vibration Damien could feel more than hear. Chief remained rigid, a gray-white statue of pure, focused intent. Damien slid out of the truck, keeping the chassis between himself and the cabin. His ranger training, buried under months of grief and paperwork, surged back to the surface. He moved in a low crouch, his boots making almost no sound in the damp soil. He didn't approach the door. He flanked it, using the overgrown bushes as cover until he was pressed flat against the moss-covered logs of the cabin's blind side. He listened. Nothing. No voices, no movement, just the faint crackle of a small fire. He edged his way to the corner, peering around it. The front door was old, heavy plank wood, and it was slightly ajar. sloppy, or desperate. He took a deep breath, held it, and moved. In 3 quick, silent steps, he crossed the sagging porch and was at the door. He put his hand flat against the wood and pushed. A long, agonizing screech of old hinges, protesting in the damp air, ripped through the clearing. He flinched, expecting the sharp report of a gunshot. "Don't come any closer." The voice was female, high and thin with panic. Damien froze in the doorway, half in, half out. His eyes, accustomed to the gray daylight, struggled to adjust to the dim, musty interior. The cabin smelled of old smoke, damp wood, and fear. In the far corner, near a small, inefficient-looking stone fireplace, stood a woman. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark, tangled hair that fell around a pale, gaunt face. Her eyes were wide, consumed by terror. But it was the 2 things she held that stopped Damien cold. One was an old pump-action shotgun, its muzzle wavering unsteadily but aimed directly at his chest. The other was her left hand, pressed protectively against the high, taut swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant. Her hands were shaking so badly that the barrel of the gun made small, frantic circles in the air. Damien knew this was infinitely more dangerous than a trained opponent. A professional wouldn't fire by accident. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. He raised his hands slowly, palms open and empty, showing he was unarmed. "I'm not here to hurt you." Outside, a single sharp explosion of sound erupted as Chief barked, sensing his owner's tension. The woman shrieked, a small, terrified sound, and her finger tightened on the trigger. "Call off your dog. Tell him to go away." "He stays outside," Damien said, his voice firm but soothing. He didn't dare move. "He won't come in. Just lower the gun. Please, I'm not a threat." "Who are you? What do you want?" she cried, her voice cracking. "My name is Damien Foster. I bought this place." That stopped her. Her panicked breathing hitched. "What? No, you're lying. This is a safe place." "I'm not lying," he said gently. "It was a foreclosure, from the county auction." He needed to prove it. This situation had to be de-escalated now. "I have the papers, in my jacket. I'm going to reach for them, very slowly." Her eyes narrowed, the shotgun barrel jerking upward. "Don't." "It's just paper," he insisted. "I'm not going to hurt you or your baby." He moved his right hand with exaggerated slowness, never breaking eye contact. He unzipped his canvas jacket and reached inside, pulling out the folded, creased deed. "Damien Foster, see?" He held it up. "That's me." He didn't walk toward her. He tossed the packet of papers onto the dusty wooden floor about halfway between them. She stared at the papers, then back at his face, her mind clearly struggling to process this new reality. He wasn't an attacker. He wasn't an enemy she could fight. He was just a man who owned the roof over her head. The tension, the adrenaline that had been holding her upright, evaporated all at once. The shotgun's weight became too much. The barrel dropped, pointing at the floorboards. She stumbled back, one hand flailing for balance, and sank onto a rickety wooden chair. The gun rested uselessly across her lap. She looked utterly, hopelessly defeated. The immediate danger was over. Damien let out the breath he'd been holding. He opened the door wider, his eyes still on her. "Chief, in. Easy." The dog entered like a gray shadow. He was no longer growling, but his body was rigid, hackles still partially raised. He moved fluidly, immediately positioning himself between Damien and the stranger, his intelligent eyes locked on her, a low rumble still present. He was ready to react to any sudden movement. The woman, who Damien now saw, was named Vanessa Brooks, according to the summary, didn't seem to register the dog. She just stared at the floor, her world shrinking to the few square feet of space she occupied. Then, the strangest thing happened. Chief stopped rumbling. He took a hesitant step forward, his body language shifting from guard to curious. His head tilted. A high, confused whine escaped his throat. Damien tensed. "Chief?" The dog ignored the command. He moved past Damien's leg, walking slowly, cautiously, right up to Vanessa's chair. She flinched, raising a hand to her face as if expecting a blow. Chief stopped. He sniffed her trembling hand. Then, impossibly, he pushed his broad, noble head under her palm, nudging it. He whined again, a sound of deep, unmistakable recognition and comfort. Damien stood there, completely stunned. Chief was a one-man dog. He tolerated others. He did not seek affection from them. He never did this. His gaze snapped from the dog to the woman, and finally to what Chief was sniffing. It was the shirt Vanessa was wearing. It was a man's flannel, heavy and worn, far too large for her. It was red and black plaid. Damien's blood ran cold. He knew that shirt. He knew the small L-shaped tear near the left cuff where James had snagged it on a nail gun 2 summers ago. He knew the faint paint stain on the shoulder. It was his brother's favorite shirt. "That's James's," Damien said. The words came out flat, hollow, an accusation and a question in one. Vanessa's face, which had been pale and numb, crumpled. The dam of terror and grief she had been holding back broke. A raw sob tore out of her, echoing in the small, cold cabin. He was my boyfriend," she choked out, her free hand clutching the flannel, tears streaming down her face. "He told me to come here. He said it was safe. He told me to hide here." Damien just stood in the doorway, the musty air feeling too thin to breathe. The world tilted. His dog, who had barely mourned anyone, was actively comforting this stranger. This pregnant stranger. His brother James hadn't just died. He hadn't just left a mountain of debt. He had left this. He had left a pregnant girlfriend hiding in a foreclosed, rotting cabin that Damien, by some cruel cosmic joke, had just purchased. The shock gave way to a cold, sharp spark of resentment, a sudden bitter anger at the brother he loved and could no longer understand. Why? Why would James hide this from him? The tableau held for a long, stretched-out second. Damien frozen in the doorway, Vanessa sobbing into her hands, and Chief acting as a silent, warm bridge between them. The dog's patient whine, a sound of shared grief, finally broke Damien's paralysis. His resentment for James, a sharp, cold spike of betrayal, was still there, but it was eclipsed by the immediate reality. A pregnant, terrified woman was wearing his dead brother's shirt in a rotting cabin that he now apparently owned. The situation was impossible, but it was also right in front of him. And Damien Foster was, above all, a man who dealt with what was right in front of him. He took a step inside, his boot thudding heavily on the warped floorboards. He pulled the warped door shut behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt unnervingly final. The air inside was frigid. The small fire in the hearth was little more than smoking embers. "It's cold," he said, his voice flat. "That fire won't last." Vanessa looked up, her face streaked with tears and grime. She seemed to shrink under his gaze, as if expecting to be thrown out. Before she could answer, a sudden, violent gust of wind hit the cabin. The entire structure groaned, and the plastic bag stuffed in the broken window pane snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Damien moved past her, his ranger instincts taking over. He wiped a clean patch on the grimy glass of the other window and looked out. What he had driven through was a light flurry. What was happening now was something else entirely. The world outside was gone, erased by a solid, swirling wall of white. The wind was no longer a whisper. It was a low, mournful howl. "It's a blizzard," he said, the words dropping like stones into the cabin's cold silence. "A whiteout. That trail I came in on, it's gone." He was trapped with her, and with his brother's secrets. He turned back to the room. "I have to get my gear from the trailer before it's buried. And we need firewood. Now?" He left the door open and went back to the porch, his body braced against the wind. Chief, understanding the shift in tone, followed at his heel. He unhitched the trailer, his hands already growing numb, and manhandled it closer to the cabin. He pulled out a heavy-duty tarp, his axe, and his rucksack. When he returned, Vanessa was standing exactly where he had left her, a pale ghost in the center of the room. Chief went directly to her and sat at her feet, looking up at her with a concerned tilt of his head. The dog's loyalty, so freely given to her, made Damien's next words feel rough in his throat. "You need to talk," he said, not unkindly, as he spread the tarp over the broken window frame. "You have to tell me everything. Why are you here? Who are you hiding from? And why does my dog know you?" Vanessa wrapped her arms around her stomach, her gaze fixed on Chief. He knows me because of James." Her voice was barely a whisper. "James brought him by my apartment a few times. He said Chief was the only one in the world he trusted completely." Damien stopped his work. He looked at the dog, who was now resting his chin on Vanessa's knee. "We were in love," she continued, her voice gaining a small measure of strength. "But we had to keep it a secret." "Why?" Damien asked, though a cold dread was already forming in his gut. "Because of him, Adrian Wells." Damien knew the name. Adrian Wells was the money. The investor who had partnered with Foster Brothers Construction 3 years ago, the one with the expensive suits and the blindingly white smile. James had brought him in, saying they needed his capital to expand. Damien had never liked him. What about Wells? James found things. In the books. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear, Damien couldn't tell. He was so smart, Damien, smarter than anyone knew. He found irregularities, big ones, money moving from jobs that didn't exist, payments to shell companies. She took a shaky breath. He said Wells was using Foster Brothers, using your name, to wash money, to launder it, millions. Damien stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The sudden, bad investments, the angry clients, the financial black hole that had swallowed his company after James died. It wasn't incompetence. It was theft. It was a setup. He was so scared, she whispered, tears welling up again. Not for himself. He was scared for me. For this. She placed a hand on her stomach. He told me Wells was dangerous, not just a white-collar criminal, genuinely dangerous. So he hid you? Yes, he bought this cabin 2 months ago, under a false name, all cash. He drove me up here himself with supplies. He said it was the only place he knew of that was completely off the grid. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading. He was going to expose Wells. He was going to fix everything. Damien's anger at his brother dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. James hadn't been reckless. He had been trying to protect them all, and he had died for it. He gave me this, Vanessa said. She fumbled in the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a heavy, dark gray satellite phone. He said, "Don't use your cell phone, ever. They can track it. Only use this. There is one number in it, only one." Damien recognized the military-grade model. Who was the number? A man named Henry Lawson. James said he was an old friend from his college days, an FBI agent. The name hit Damien like a physical blow. Henry Lawson. He'd met him once, years ago, a sharp, no-nonsense guy. He'd had no idea James stayed in touch with him. "Did you call him?" Damien asked, his voice urgent. "The day I got here, about 2 weeks ago, I told him what James told me to say, about Wells, the money laundering, everything." "And?" Vanessa's face fell. "He believed me. He sounded worried. But he said it was complicated. He said, 'We are investigating, but these things take time, Vanessa. Wells is insulated. He has lawyers, judges.' He told me to stay hidden, to not move, not contact anyone else, and to wait. He said they were working on it, but it wasn't fast enough. The silence that fell was heavier than the snow outside. They were alone. The one person who knew they existed was tangled in bureaucracy, and the man who wanted them gone was powerful and free." They spent the next few hours in a grim, functional truce. Damien used the tarp and some loose floorboards from the porch to seal the broken window. He chopped the wood he'd found under the trailer, and soon a real fire was blazing in the hearth, pushing back the oppressive cold. As night fell, the storm reached a terrifying new intensity. The wind screamed, and the cabin shuddered under the assault. Inside, a fragile peace had settled. Damien sat on his pack, cleaning the shotgun Vanessa had given him. Vanessa was huddled by the fire, wrapped in a sleeping bag Damien had unpacked. Chief lay between them, a silent guardian, his head on his paws, though his eyes were open, tracking the shadows. Suddenly, the dog's head lifted. A low, sharp whine vibrated in his throat. Damien's hand stopped moving. "What is it, boy?" In one fluid motion, Chief was on his feet. He moved to the door, his body rigid, the fur on his back standing up. He wasn't growling, just staring at the door, vibrating with tension. Then Damien heard it. Underneath the roar of the wind, there was another sound. A low, deep thrum that didn't belong. It was the sound of a high-performance engine, powerful and disciplined, straining against the snow. A loud, frantic bark exploded from Chief. It was not a question. It was an alarm. Damien grabbed the shotgun and extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the flickering fire. He moved to the small, intact window and scraped a patch of frost away. Through the swirling wall of snow, he saw them. 2 pairs of piercing, high-intensity LED headlights. They weren't from a truck. They were high off the ground, belonging to 2 massive, black luxury SUVs. They were cutting through the blizzard with terrifying ease. He saw Vanessa's reflection in the glass, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of pure terror. "No," she whispered, stumbling to her feet. "No, it's not possible. How? How did he find me?" The SUVs stopped, their lights flooding the cabin, pinning them like insects. Damien turned to her, his face grim. "Who?" Vanessa was shaking her head, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Adrian Wells." The high-intensity beams of the SUVs cut through the swirling snow, turning the cabin into a stage and pinning them in a harsh, artificial daylight. Damien felt Vanessa flinch behind him, a small, choked sound escaping her. "Get away from the window," he ordered, his voice low and hard. "Go to the back wall, near the fireplace. Stay low." Outside, the powerful engines idled, a deep, confident rumble that was a counterpoint to the howling wind. Then the heavy, solid thud of a car door closing, followed by 2 more. Damien moved, pressing himself against the wall next to the door, shotgun held ready, but pointed at the floor. He didn't need to tell Chief what to do. The dog was already silent. The frantic alarm barks had ceased, replaced by a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. Heavy footsteps crunched on the snow-covered porch. They were slow, unhurried. These were not men worried about the storm. A sharp, polite knock echoed through the cabin. 3 precise raps. It was the knock of a guest, not an intruder, and that made it all the more terrifying. Damien looked at Vanessa. She was pressed against the stone of the hearth, her face as white as the snow outside. He gave her a sharp nod, then took a steadying breath. He reached over and pulled the door open, using his own body as a barrier. The man standing in the center of the porch was the visual definition of out of place. This was Adrian Wells. He was in his early 50s, with perfectly styled, silver-gray hair and a face that looked like it belonged on the cover of a business magazine. He was impeccably dressed. Despite the blizzard, he wore a dark cashmere overcoat, unbuttoned, revealing a tailored suit. His leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, were already dusted with snow, an offense he seemed to be ignoring through sheer force of will. He smiled, a wide, dazzlingly white expression of pure false courtesy. Flanking him were 2 large men. The one on his left, Jonah Reed, was thin and wiry, with a long face and pale, watchful eyes that scanned everything, the broken window, the roofline, Damien, before settling. The other, Damon Scott, was a wall of muscle, thick-necked and broad, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a heavy-duty parka. "Vanessa? My dear?" Adrian Wells said, his voice smooth and educated, projecting just enough to be heard over the wind. "Thank goodness. We were so terribly worried." He made to step forward, his eyes focused entirely on Vanessa, as if Damien were merely a piece of furniture. Damien didn't raise the shotgun. He simply shifted his weight, his shoulder blocking the entryway completely. Wells stopped. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes, a cold, clear blue, finally focused on Damien. The feigned concern was replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "And who is this?" "I'm Damien Foster," Damien said, his voice flat. "I own this cabin." Wells's perfectly groomed eyebrows rose. "You own it?" "I see." He recalibrated instantly, the charming mask slipping back into place. "Mr. Foster, a pleasure. I'm Adrian Wells. I'm a friend of Vanessa's and a business partner of her late boyfriend James." He nodded toward Vanessa, who was trying to make herself invisible against the back wall. "We've been searching for her for weeks. She's not well." At that moment, Damien felt something shift inside him. He looked at Wells's clean, expensive face. He looked at his two hired thugs. Then he looked at Vanessa, trembling, pregnant, and wearing his dead brother's shirt. The cold, sharp resentment he'd felt for James, for the secrets, the debt, the whole impossible mess, evaporated. It was gone. It didn't matter why James had hidden her or what he'd failed to tell his brother. All that mattered was that he had hidden her, and that this smiling, cashmere-clad man was the reason. The mission was suddenly, starkly clear. His protective instincts, honed by years in the service, surged forward, eclipsing everything else. He was no longer a failed businessman. He was a shield. His stance widened, his feet planting themselves on the old floor. "She seems fine to me." "Ah," Wells said, giving Damien a look of polite condescension. "But you don't know her. James's passing, it was a terrible shock, a tragedy." He spoke the word as if he'd rehearsed it. "We all understood she needed time, but running off like this, in her condition, it's not rational." He was speaking to Damien now, trying to recruit him, man to man, painting this as a mental health crisis. "She's grieving, Mr. Foster, deeply confused. She needs proper medical care, which is why I'm here, to take her home." "He's lying!" Vanessa's voice was a desperate shriek from the fireplace. "Damien, he's lying. He's the one who—" "You see?" Wells interrupted, his expression turning to one of profound, practiced sadness. "She's hysterical. She doesn't know what she's saying. This isn't good for the baby." He made a move to step past Damien. "Now, Vanessa, that's enough. Let's get you in the car." Jonah Reed and Damon Scott took a simultaneous step forward, their hands emerging from their pockets. But there was a second barrier. Chief, who had been standing beside Damien, moved. He stepped directly into the doorway, positioning himself in front of Damien. The dog's head was low, his silver-gray hackles fully raised. The growl was no longer a vibration. It was an audible, guttural threat that promised violence. The dog was not just protecting Damien. He was protecting the cabin. He was protecting the woman who smelled like his lost master. Wells and his men stopped cold. For the first time, Wells's smile tightened. His eyes dropped from Damien's face to the dog. He was no fool. He recognized the breed, the posture, the absolute lack of fear. This was not a pet. This was a trained canine. His gaze then traveled to Damien, to the easy, solid way he stood, the calmness in his eyes, the professional way his hands held the shotgun. He wasn't some backwoods homesteader. He was a soldier. Adrian Wells was a man who assessed risk. He looked at the ranger, he looked at the canine, and he looked past them into the swirling, impenetrable wall of the blizzard. This was a bad strategic position, a firefight in a whiteout in unfamiliar territory against two trained opponents. It was messy. It was bad for business. He raised a single, perfectly manicured hand. Jonah Reed and Damon Scott relaxed, but their eyes remained locked on Damien. "Well," Wells said, his voice losing none of its manufactured pleasantry. "It seems you're quite protective, Mr. Foster. Admirable." He took a deliberate step back off the porch. "But you're interfering in a private, delicate family matter." "This is my property," Damien said, his voice a flat line. "That makes it my business." "She's not leaving." The silence stretched. The wind howled around them, filling the space between the men. Wells finally nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "Very well. It's a terrible night. We can't very well drag her out in this storm, can we? That would be uncivilized." He was making a tactical retreat. "You're trapped here, Mr. Foster. We all are, it seems." He gave a small, unamused laugh. "We'll wait for the storm to clear, but make no mistake, we will be back to ensure Vanessa gets the help she so desperately needs." He turned his back on them, a calculated display of dominance, and walked calmly through the snow to his SUV. Reed and Scott followed, their backward glances filled with a cold promise. The heavy thud of 3 car doors slammed shut. The blinding high beams clicked off, plunging the clearing back into the eerie twilight of the storm. But the SUVs did not leave. Their engines remained on, a low, powerful thrum in the night. Their parking lights cut through the snow, 2 pairs of small red eyes in the darkness, waiting. Damien slammed the cabin door and drove the heavy iron deadbolt home. He heard the scrape of a chair as Vanessa wedged it under the knob. He let out a long, ragged breath, the shotgun suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He turned to face Vanessa, the reality of their situation settling in. The cabin wasn't a refuge. It was a fortress, and they were under siege. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place was the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the storm shrieked, a high-pitched, relentless assault, and beneath it, the deep mechanical rumble of the idling SUVs was a promise. They were not leaving. Damien turned from the door, his movements measured, the shotgun still held in a ready position. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space feel alive and threatening. Vanessa was still pressed against the back wall, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough stone of the hearth. Chief stood between them, a solid, unmoving sentinel of gray fur, his gaze fixed on the door. Damien broke the silence, his voice rough. "You said he was dangerous. You didn't say he was a killer." Vanessa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new, sharper fear. "You don't understand. He didn't just find problems in the books, Damien. He proved it." She was shivering, but this time it was not from the cold. "James was so smart. He loved computers, you know? He always said he was wasted on construction. He set up a mirror on the company server. He had copies of everything. Invoices, bank transfers to offshore accounts, audio files. He recorded conversations with Wells." Damien felt his blood run cold. This was not just a case of an older brother underestimating his sibling. James had been running a full-blown counterintelligence operation. "He was building a case," Damien murmured. "Yes, for Henry Lawson, for the FBI." Vanessa's voice was desperate, as if she needed him to finally, truly understand the stakes. But Wells found out. James must have gotten careless, or maybe Wells was just always one step ahead, 3 days before the end. "James called me. He never used his real phone, only burners. He was whispering. He said, 'He knows. He knows what I have. He threatened me, Vanessa. He threatened us.'" She pushed herself off the wall, her hands clenched into fists. "And then the accident. I saw the police report. Catastrophic brake failure. Do you know what James told me just 1 week before that? He told me he'd had his brakes serviced. He said he was being careful. He said, 'Wells is the kind of guy who cuts brake lines, not the kind who hires a lawyer.'" She was sobbing now, open, agonizing sounds. "He didn't die. He was murdered. Adrian Wells murdered him. And he did it to get to me. To get to what James found." Damien felt the floor tilt beneath him. Murdered. It wasn't an abstract bad guy anymore. It was a name and a method. The brother he had patronized, the sibling he had seen as the salesman while he was the builder, had been fighting a war Damien knew nothing about. And then the final unvoiced question hung in the air. Damien looked at her, at the protective hand splayed across her stomach. "The baby," he said, the words feeling thick and strange on his tongue. "It's James's." Vanessa nodded, a fresh wave of tears choking her. We were going to tell you, After this was over. Damien turned away from her. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at the dog. He needed to move. He began to pace, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, the cabin suddenly feeling like a coffin. He felt a white-hot, suffocating rage build in his chest, so intense it made his vision swim. But the anger wasn't for Wells. Not yet. It was for James. "Why?" he whispered, the question torn from him. He slammed his fist into the log wall, the impact dull and unsatisfying. Chief flinched, a small whine escaping him, confused by his master's sudden violence. "Why did you do this alone, James?" he raged, speaking to the ghost in the room. "Why didn't you come to me? I'm your brother. I'm a ranger. This is what I do. I protect people." He was breathing heavily, his mind flashing back through the last 6 months. James had been quiet, stressed. Damien had assumed it was just the business, the late payments. He had clapped him on the shoulder and told him to tough it out. The anger collapsed, draining away as quickly as it had come, leaving a hollow, crushing guilt in its place. "And where was I?" he said to the empty room. He stopped pacing, his head bowed. "I was drowning in my own memories, my own self-pity. He was fighting a monster, and I wasn't there. I wasn't there for him. I failed him." He had been trained to never, ever leave a man behind, and he had left his own brother. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than his rucksack, heavier than the trailer he'd dragged up the mountain. He finally, slowly, turned back to look at Vanessa. She was watching him, her fear of him now mixed with a deep, shared sorrow. She wasn't just a stranger. She wasn't a problem. She was his brother's last legacy. She and the unborn child, the last living piece of James. In that instant, the broken, bankrupt, grieving man who had driven up the mountain disappeared. The fog of his depression evaporated, burned away by a sudden, clarifying purpose. The ranger returned. His resolve hardened into something cold and pure. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He wasn't even just fighting to protect her. He was fighting for redemption. He was going to finish what his brother started. He was going to burn Adrian Wells to the ground, or die trying. "All right," he said, his voice completely changed. It was calm, measured, and full of a cold authority Vanessa had not heard before. "Listen to me. We have—" He never finished the sentence. The night outside the cabin was torn apart by a violent, deafening concussion. A sound of a sudden, whooshing explosion rocked the cabin on its foundations. The ground itself seemed to jump. Damien reacted without thinking. He lunged, grabbing Vanessa and throwing them both to the floor, covering her body with his own as the patched window frame blew inward, spraying them with freezing snow and tarp fragments. Chief was barking, a deep, frantic, terrifying sound. A wave of intense heat washed over the room, followed by a brilliant, flickering orange light that illuminated every corner of the cabin. Damien, his ears ringing, slowly raised his head. He crept to the edge of the window, his heart hammering. He saw it, and his blood turned to ice. His truck, his trailer, his entire life, his tools, his supplies, his food, his only way out, was a raging inferno. A fireball of burning metal and rubber, collapsing in on itself, painting the white snow in grotesque shades of orange and black. Wells wasn't just waiting. He was sending a message. They were not under siege. They were in a tomb. They were officially, completely trapped. The first light of dawn was not a comfort. It was a cold, sterile gray that seeped into the cabin, revealing the true extent of their prison. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a pile of pale, glowing embers, offering almost no heat. Neither Damien nor Vanessa had slept. They had spent the night in a state of shared, silent terror, listening to the relentless scream of the wind and the deep, arrogant rumble of the idling SUVs parked just beyond the tree line. The vehicles were a constant mechanical heartbeat in the storm, a reminder that they were being watched by men who did not feel the cold. Damien sat on the floor, his back against the wall, the shotgun resting across his knees. Every time a gust of wind rattled the door, his muscles tanged, his focus sharpening. Vanessa was huddled in the sleeping bag, her knees drawn up as much as her pregnancy would allow. She was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, but she hadn't cried again. The shock had frozen her. Chief lay between them. The dog had not truly rested. His head was up, his ears constantly swiveling, analyzing the sounds of the storm, the creaking of the cabin, and the distant, unchanging thrum of the engines. He was a tightly coiled spring, his body rigid with a protective energy that was almost palpable. As the gray light brightened, Damien saw that the snow was no longer falling in a blinding sheet. The blizzard had broken. The wind still howled, but the visibility had returned, revealing a world transformed, buried under a deep, suffocating blanket of white. He got to his feet, his joints aching from the cold and tension. "Stay here," he said to Vanessa. "Stay away from the window." She just nodded, her eyes fixed on him. Damien moved to the door. He unbarred it, the heavy bolt sliding back with a grim metallic sound. He opened the door a crack, his body braced. The air that hit him was arctic, a physical blow that stole his breath. He scanned the clearing. The two black SUVs were still there, exactly where they had been, parked in a silent, menacing V formation at the edge of the trail. Their red tail lights glowed like the eyes of a predator. There was no movement. "Chief, with me." He stepped out onto the porch, the fresh snow crunching under his boots. Chief was at his side instantly, moving low and fluid, his gray-white fur making him almost invisible against the snow. Damien's gaze was drawn irresistibly to the center of the clearing. His truck, his trailer, his life. It was nothing more than a blackened, skeletal ruin. The U-Haul trailer was a warped, melted box of aluminum, its contents incinerated, reduced to ash and slag. The pickup truck was a grotesque sculpture of charred steel, the tires melted off the rims, the engine block exposed to the sky. The fire had been so intensely hot that it had melted the glass in the windows into drooping, icicle-like shapes. It was a funeral pyre. Everything. His tools, his father's flag, his clothes, the few photographs of James he had left. Everything he had salvaged from the shipwreck of his old life was gone, vaporized. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, a cold, empty rage mixing with a profound, suffocating helplessness. This wasn't just a threat. This was an execution. Wells had not only trapped him, he had erased him. He had cut Damien's last tie to the world, leaving him with nothing but a broken-down cabin and a shotgun with a handful of shells. He felt a deep, shaking tremor start in his legs. He was trapped, unarmed, and responsible for the woman and unborn child inside. He was a ranger, trained for this, but he had never felt so utterly, hopelessly outmaneuvered. He was so focused on the magnitude of his loss, on the symbolic destruction of his past, that it took him a full minute to realize that Chief was no longer at his side. He turned, his heart jumping, scanning the tree line for a threat. But Chief was not in danger. He was working. The dog was 20 yards away at the edge of the woods, completely ignoring the smoldering, blackened wreck of the truck. The fire was old news to him. His nose was to the ground, his powerful shoulders tensed. He was tracking. "Chief?" Damien called softly. The dog didn't look up. He moved with a new, intense focus, his tail rigid. He was quartering the ground, sniffing the air, then dropping his nose back to the snow. He seemed agitated, confused, sniffing one spot, and then letting out a low, frustrated woof of air. Damien's training kicked in, pushing past the wave of helpless rage. He knew that behavior. Chief wasn't tracking an animal. He was tracking a chemical. Damien moved toward him, his boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Chief was focused on a spot near a large ponderosa pine, a place that offered a clear, covered view of the cabin. It was the exact spot where someone would stand to watch, to wait, to plan. As Damien approached, Chief's behavior changed again. He stopped tracking and froze, his nose pressed deep into the snow at the base of the tree. He sniffed once, twice, then looked back at Damien, his intelligent eyes bright. Then he did it. He made a light, distinct scratching motion with his right front paw, brushing the top layer of snow aside. It was not a digging motion, it was a signal, a trained canine alert. "Show me," Damien whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. He knelt beside the dog, his gloved hand brushing away the powder. He saw it instantly. The snow beneath was not white. It was stained a dark, greasy brown in a partial boot print that had been mostly covered by the new snowfall. But it wasn't the print that held his attention. It was the smell. It was sharp, chemical, and unmistakable, cutting through the clean scent of the pine and the cold. It was the heavy, acrid tang of gasoline. An accelerant. A wave of icy clarity washed over Damien. He looked from the stain back to the burned-out truck. They hadn't just thrown a match. They hadn't used a road flare or a Molotov from a distance. Wells's men, Jonah Reed or Damon Scott or both, had used the cover of the blizzard to walk right up to his truck. They had stood here under this tree, and then they had calmly, methodically, doused his entire life in gasoline and set it ablaze. The sheer arrogant confidence of it, the calculated cruelty. Damien stood up, his helplessness gone, replaced by something else, a cold, hard certainty. He looked over at the two black SUVs, still idling, still watching. They weren't just waiting him out. They were toying with him, and they had made a mistake. They had left a witness. He put his hand on Chief's broad head. The dog looked up at him, tail giving a single, brief wag. His job done. "Good boy, Chief," Damien whispered, his voice tight. "Good boy." The acrid smell of gasoline was a sharp, ugly stain on the clean, cold air. Damien knelt in the snow, his breath pluming in front of his face. His world had narrowed to this small, disturbed patch of white at the base of the pine tree. Chief stood beside him, his duty done. The dog had given the alert, the small, deliberate scratch with his paw that said, "Here." Not just, "I smell something," but "I smell something, and there is an object associated with it." Damien plunged his bare hand into the snow. The cold was so intense, it was like plunging his hand into a bucket of needles. His fingers, already numb, fumbled at the frozen crust, digging past the surface, chasing the source of the canine alert. For a second, there was nothing but frozen mud and pine needles. He dug deeper, his desperation mixing with a cold, analytical focus. They had stood right here. They had been sloppy. His fingertips brushed something small, hard and metallic. He grabbed it, his fist closing around the object. He pulled his hand back, the freezing mud clinging to his skin. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the two black SUVs idling at the edge of the clearing. They were still there, watching, waiting. He wiped the freezing slush off the object onto the thigh of his jeans, smearing a dark streak across the denim. It was a Zippo, a standard silver brushed chrome Zippo lighter. It was heavy, solid, and cold. 1,000 men in the service had carried one just like it. 1,000 men in Idaho probably had one in their pocket. It was nothing. It was a piece of trash dropped by a careless thug. His thumb, moving on pure muscle memory, found the hinge and flicked it open. A sharp, metallic click cut through the wind. He spun the flint wheel. A weak spark, then a second, stronger one, and a tiny, struggling blue and yellow flame sputtered to life. It still had fuel in it. It had been used very recently. His eyes dropped from the small flame to the casing. He turned it over in his palm. And the world, which had been spinning, came to a dead, silent stop. Engraved on the side, in a simple, clean script, were two initials. J.F. Damien's knees buckled. He didn't fall, but he had to put a hand out to the rough bark of the pine tree to steady himself. The breath he had been holding escaped him in a ragged, pained gasp. It wasn't a lighter. It was the lighter. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. James's 30th birthday, just last spring. The world had still made sense then. The company was doing well. They had been grilling in the backyard. Damien had been at a loss for what to get his younger brother, the man who loved style, but was always broke. He'd found the lighter in an antique shop. He'd had it engraved. He remembered handing it to James. He'd laughed, his eyes bright. "A bit old school, brother," James had said, flicking it open with a theatrical snap. "But I absolutely love it. It's got class. Chic." James had carried it everywhere. It was his good luck charm, his fidget toy. It should have been in his pocket when he died. It should have been in the glove compartment of his wrecked car. It should have been on his nightstand. It should not be here in the snow, 20 yards from Damien's burning truck, reeking of gasoline. The logic was brutal, simple, and inescapable. James had been murdered. The killer had gone through his pockets, and he had taken a souvenir. Damien's mind flashed to the porch, to the two men flanking Wells. Not the broad, muscular one, Damon Scott. No, the other one. The thin, wiry man with the long face and the pale, dead eyes. Jonah Reed. The one who had watched Damien not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. He had this. He had kept it. A trophy. And then the final horrific piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The arrogance, the sheer, profound, sickening arrogance. Jonah Reed hadn't just kept his brother's lighter, he had used it. He had stood right here, in the cold, pulled his brother's good luck charm from his own pocket, sparked it to life, and had set Damien's entire life on fire with it. He had used James's gift to destroy James's brother. Damien closed his fist around the metal, the edges digging deep into his palm. A tremor started in his hand, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. It wasn't from the cold. It was a rage so pure and so hot it threatened to consume him. He felt a low, animalistic sound rumble in his own chest, and it was only then that he realized he was growling. A cold, wet nose pressed hard against his clenched fist. Damien flinched, his head snapping down. Chief was looking up at him. The dog's canine posture was gone. This was not the alert state. This was not the guard state. This was something else. Chief whined, a low, empathetic, questioning sound. He could feel the rage rolling off Damien in waves, a scent as potent as the gasoline. He didn't understand the lighter, but he understood the anguish. He pushed his head harder against Damien's hand, a solid, grounding pressure. "I am here. Come back." Damien's vision cleared. He looked at the dog, this animal who had known his brother, who was now protecting his brother's legacy. Chief was the living, breathing bridge between the man he had been and the man he had to become. The rage did not go away. It simply cooled. It solidified. It settled deep in his gut, a hard, cold core of absolute certainty. The shaking in his hand stopped. He slowly, deliberately opened his fist. He looked at the lighter one last time. JF. This was no longer a siege. It was not a fight for survival. Wells had made it a trap, but Reed, in his arrogance, had made it personal. This was now a hunt. This lighter was not just a clue. It was not just a memory. It was a promise. It was a vow, sealed in steel and snow. Damien snapped the Zippo shut, the small, sharp click echoing in the vast, cold clearing. He slid it deep into his pocket, where it rested against his thigh like a piece of ice. He turned his back on the smoldering ruin of his truck. He turned his back on his past. He looked at the cabin where Vanessa was waiting, his mission. Then he looked at the two SUVs, their engines still rumbling, his targets. He started walking back, his steps steady and measured. Chief fell into place at his left heel, moving in perfect, silent unison. The fight was no longer about getting away. It was about seeing this through to the end. The walk back to the cabin was the longest 20 yards of Damien's life. The Zippo lighter felt like a piece of burning coal in his pocket, a physical weight of grief and fury. He moved through the deep snow, his steps precise, his breathing controlled. The helplessness he'd felt while watching his truck burn was gone. The rage he'd felt when he found the lighter had not dissipated. It had cooled, sharpening into a razor-fine, lethal focus. Chief matched his pace, a silent gray shadow at his heel. The dog knew. The energy had shifted. The master who had been grieving was gone. The ranger had taken his place. Damien pushed the cabin door open. Vanessa was exactly where he'd left her, huddled by the dying fire, her eyes wide with a desperate, questioning fear. He didn't say a word. He walked to the small, rickety table and placed the silver lighter on it. Vanessa stared at it. What is that? JF, Damien said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. James Foster. Her eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She recognized it. He was here, Damien said, the words cutting through the cold air. The man who murdered your boyfriend. He was here, at the edge of the woods. He used this, James's lighter, to set my truck on fire, and then he was careless enough to drop it. The full, sickening arrogance of the act settled over them. This wasn't just a siege, it was a game to them. Damien turned, his back to her, and began a methodical assessment of the cabin. He was no longer a civilian seeking refuge. He was a soldier analyzing a defensive position. One door, two windows, one of which was barely a hole covered by a tarp. A stone fireplace that was a structural strong point. He's coming back, Damien stated. He began checking the shotgun shells, lining them up on the mantel. He burned the truck to take away our hope. Now he'll come to finish the job. As if summoned by his words, a strange electronic chirping sound filled the room. Vanessa jumped, letting out a small shriek. What's that? Damien's head snapped to the source, the satellite phone. It was on the floor, next to the rucksack she'd pulled it from. It was ringing, a sound so alien in this primitive, desperate place that it felt like a violation. Vanessa stared at it in horror. But that's impossible. It only has one number, Henry Lawson. It can't receive calls. Unless Wells already had this number, Damien said, his mind racing. From James's records. He knew about this phone. He was letting you think you were safe. The phone continued its insistent chirping summons. Damien looked at Vanessa, his eyes cold and hard. Answer it! Put it on speaker. Her hands trembling, Vanessa picked up the heavy device and pressed the green button. Hello? A voice filled the cabin. It was not a crackling, distant sound. It was perfectly clear, smooth, and laced with a terrifying, familiar courtesy. Good morning, Vanessa, said Adrian Wells. And Mr. Foster, I do hope you slept well, though I imagine the light from the fire made it rather difficult. Damien moved to stand beside the phone. He said nothing. Ah, the soldier is there, Wells continued, his tone conversational. Yes, Mr. Foster, I've made some inquiries while we waited. Damien Foster, 75th Ranger Regiment, multiple deployments, very, very impressive. A cold pause. In fact, far too impressive to let you just wander off into the woods, wouldn't you agree? I know what you're thinking, Ranger. You're thinking you can slip out the back, use the storm's cover, use the trees, take my men out one by one. Guerrilla tactics. It's very much your style. Damien's jaw tightened. That was exactly what he had been planning. So, Wells said, his voice dripping with false regret, I took the liberty of neutralizing that strategy. I'd like you to look at the ridge, to the northeast. But very carefully, please. Damien moved to the one intact window, the glass opaque with frost. He scraped a small circle clear with his fingernail. He peered out at the distant snow-covered ridge, a line of dark pines against the gray sky. He saw nothing, just trees and snow. You won't see him, Wells said, as if reading his mind. He's very good. His name is Brett Morgan. He's a professional, just like you, and his .338 rifle is currently aimed at the small window of the cabin's back room, the one I assume you've designated as your safe room, the one where Vanessa, I imagine, has been trying to rest. Damien's blood turned to ice. He looked across the small cabin at the single other door, which led to the tiny, dark bedroom. It was the only place with a bed, the only place he had told Vanessa to go if the shooting started. Wells had anticipated his every move. So here is the new reality, Mr. Foster. This is a pincer movement. I am at your front door. Mr. Morgan is at your back. If you open that door, If anyone steps outside for any reason, Mr. Morgan will put a bullet through Vanessa's head. You are pinned down. The woods are no longer your friend. This cabin is your cage." The finality of the words hung in the air. Damien was trapped. He couldn't flank. He couldn't escape. He couldn't use his skills, his training, his instincts. Wells had forced him into a CQC, a close-quarters combat fight, in a tiny, indefensible box, and Wells would control when and how the fight began. "What do you want, Wells?" Damien's voice was a low growl. "Straight to business. I like that," Wells chuckled. "I could, of course, just have Mr. Morgan fire anyway, or we could simply wait for you to freeze to death. But that would be imprecise. It would risk destroying something I need." He paused, letting the tension build. "James was a thief, Mr. Foster. He stole something that belongs to my organization, a USB drive. I know he had it, and I'm quite certain he gave it to her." "I don't have it," Vanessa cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please, Vanessa," Wells sighed. "Don't lie. It's unbecoming. The data on that drive is sensitive." But James, in his infinite, infuriating cleverness, encrypted it. The file is useless without the password. Wells's voice dropped its mask of politeness, becoming cold, flat, and reptilian. "And I know he gave that password to you. It's a sequence of numbers, a name, a date, something personal, something only you would know." "I am here for that password," Wells stated. "I don't even need the drive. I'm sure the FBI already has a copy, thanks to your little phone call. But I need access to those accounts before they do. I am on a clock, gentlemen and ladies." "This is why I must come in, Mr. Foster. I must persuade Vanessa to give me the password. I imagine it will be unpleasant. Torture is such a messy word, but it is accurate. I need her to talk, and I need her alive to do it." The threat was naked, brutal, and clear. "So here is the deal," Wells said, his charming tone returning. "You open the door, you hand her over, you tell me the password, and in return, I will give you your lives. I will let you and your dog walk away from this mountain. A simple, clean transaction." The cabin was silent. Damien stared at Vanessa, who was shaking her head, tears of pure terror streaming down her face. He looked at Chief, who was standing at his side, growling low, sensing the voice on the phone was the true enemy. Damien reached into his pocket. He pulled out the Zippo. He held it up to the phone. With his thumb, he flicked the lid open. A sharp metallic click echoed in the small room. He spun the wheel. A single spark. He spun it again. A small, brave flame ignited. The sound of the lighter, the scrape of the flint, and the click of the lid was the only answer he gave. A long, cold silence stretched over the line. Damien reached out and snapped the lighter shut. Another sharp, final click. Wells's voice, when it came, was no longer charming. It was a hiss of pure ice. "A very, very poor choice, Ranger." A sharp sound as the call disconnected. The cabin was plunged back into silence. But the silence was different. It was the crushing, absolute quiet before an assault. The silence that followed the disconnected call was heavier than the snow outside. It was a vacuum, a cold, breathless moment before the inevitable. Damien stood over the satellite phone, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. The Zippo felt heavy in his pocket. He turned to Vanessa. She was white, her hands pressed to her stomach, her back against the hearth. "Go to the back room, now," he said. "But the sniper," he said, "he's watching the back window, not shooting through it. He's there to pin us. They're going to come through the door. Go. Stay on the floor, away from the window, and do not make a sound." She hesitated, then scrambled into the small, dark room, pulling the flimsy door almost shut. Damien moved. There was no time for fear. There was only the mission. He grabbed the heavy, rustic wooden table and shoved it, the sound of its legs scraping on the floor a loud protest. He didn't barricade the door. That was useless. He flipped it on its side, creating a piece of low cover in the center of the room. He checked the shotgun. 5 shells. He slid one into the chamber. He went to the door and pressed his ear to the wood, listening past the wind. Nothing. He glanced at Chief. The dog was a statue of coiled muscle, his gaze locked on the door, a low, almost subsonic growl vibrating in his chest. Damien positioned himself to the left of the door, in the fatal funnel's blind spot. He was a ranger. He knew how this worked. They would come in fast, they would come in hard, and they would expect him to be on the other side of the room. He waited. The first sound was not a knock. It was the solid, heavy impact of a boot kicking the door just below the knob. The old wood groaned. A second impact, a sharp splitting sound, and the door shuddered in its frame. Chief let out a single, explosive bark of pure fury. "Now, Chief, quiet," Damien commanded. The dog obeyed, but the growl remained. The third kick was a splintering crash. The lock, the knob, and a chunk of the door jamb tore free. The door flew open, slamming back against the interior wall, revealing 2 figures, dark silhouettes against the blinding white snow. They came in as Damien expected, low and fast. The first man through was Damon Scott, the large, muscular one. He was the breacher, built to absorb and occupy. He swept right, his weapon raised, trying to clear the room, expecting Damien to be by the fire. But Damien was not by the fire. He was at the door. As Scott's momentum carried him past, Damien moved. He didn't go for the gun, he went for the man. He drove his left shoulder into Scott's hip, a brutal, checking blow that used the man's own forward motion against him. Scott stumbled, his balance broken. Damien was already in motion. He was not a brawler. He was a soldier. He held his combat knife in a reverse grip. As Scott turned, Damien brought the knife up in a hard, deliberate, upward strike, aimed not to kill, but to incapacitate. He drove the blade deep into the man's right thigh, severing muscle and artery. Damon Scott let out a hoarse, wet roar of agony and collapsed, his weapon clattering harmlessly onto the floorboards. 1 down. The second man, Jonah Reed, was already in the room. He was not a breacher. He was the killer. He saw his partner go down, and he didn't hesitate. He didn't go for Damien. He pivoted, lunging for the only other leverage in the room. The flimsy door to the back room burst open. Vanessa screamed. "No!" Damien yelled, moving. He was too late. Reed was across the small cabin in 2 strides. He grabbed Vanessa by the hair, yanking her from the dark room. She tried to fight, but he was wiry and strong. He spun her around, clamping one arm around her chest, crushing her against him. He pressed the cold, black muzzle of his pistol to her temple. The fight stopped. Damien froze, his knife in his hand, a crimson line dripping from the blade. He was 20 feet away, an impossible distance. Jonah Reed was breathing hard, his pale eyes wild. "Drop it, soldier. Drop the knife, or I'll paint the wall with her." Chief was standing near the overturned table, his growl a murderous, unbroken sound. He was locked on Reed, his body trembling, waiting for the one word that would let him launch. "I said, drop it!" Reed screamed, pressing the gun harder against Vanessa's head. A predictable stalemate, but as in chess, controlling the board is more important than taking a pawn. Adrian Wells stepped through the ruined doorway. He was completely calm, brushing a dusting of snow from the shoulders of his cashmere coat. He looked at Damon Scott, who was groaning on the floor, clutching his bleeding leg. "Messy, Jonah," Wells sighed, his voice full of disappointment. He then looked at Damien, and his cold blue eyes lit up with genuine amusement. "Well done, Ranger. Truly, I was impressed, but it's over." Wells walked calmly over and picked up the heavy pistol Scott had dropped. He held it with an easy, practiced familiarity, aimed directly at Damien's chest. "Now, Mr. Foster, the knife, on the floor, or I'll have Jonah kill her, and then I will kill you. It makes no difference to me. I'll simply have to wait for Mr. Lawson and the FBI to find the USB themselves. I'll be in another country by then. This is just tidying up." Damien was cornered, a knife against 2 guns, a sniper at his back, and a hostage. He looked at Vanessa. She was sobbing, her eyes squeezed shut. "Damien, I'm sorry." He saw the way Reed's arm was crushing her stomach. He saw the cold, dead certainty in Reed's eyes, the man who had kept his brother's lighter as a trophy. And he looked at Chief. The dog was no longer looking at Reed. He was looking at Vanessa. His canine training was being overridden by a deeper, more primitive instinct. He could smell her terror. And beneath that, he could smell the faint, familiar, beloved scent of James. The scent of his lost master was being threatened. His family was being threatened. Damien saw the dog's muscles bunch. He saw the shift in his balance. Reed was focused on Damien. Wells was focused on Damien. No one was watching the dog. This was the moment, the 1-in-a-million chance. He locked eyes with Reed. "You want the knife?" he said, his voice a low growl. On the floor. Now. Damien didn't break eye contact. He didn't look at the dog. He just gave the single explosive word of release he had trained for years. "Take him!" It was not a shout. It was a raw, guttural command that tore through the cabin. For a split second, nothing happened. Then Chief exploded. He was a blur of gray and white fur, a missile of focused rage. He didn't go for the chest or the leg. He went for the weapon. He launched himself across the room, his jaws wide. He hit Jonah Reed's right arm with the force of a battering ram. The sound was horrific, a wet, heavy crunch of bone and sinew, followed by a high, piercing, inhuman scream from Reed. The pistol fired. A deafening explosion filled the small room, the flash of the muzzle momentarily blinding. The bullet went wild, harmlessly burying itself in the ceiling rafters. Reed's grip on Vanessa was broken. He was screaming, his arm dangling, his body consumed by agony. Chief's jaws were locked, and he began to shake his head, a predatory, violent motion. Vanessa, released, scrambled away, falling behind the hearth. The moment the shot was fired, Wells flinched. His eyes, for a fatal second, snapped to the dog. It was all Damien needed. He didn't throw the knife. He lunged. While Wells was still processing the new threat, Damien covered the distance. This was not a CQC strike. This was a raw, brutal collision. He slammed into Wells, his shoulder connecting with the man's chest. The pistol Wells was holding flew from his hand, skittering into a dark corner. The mask of civilization was gone. Wells was strong, fighting with the feral desperation of a cornered executive. He raked his nails at Damien's face. But Damien was fueled by 3 months of grief, by the image of his burning truck, by the cold silver of his brother's lighter. This was not a fight. It was an exorcism. He ducked under a wild swing, hooked his arm around Wells's neck, and clamped down in a practiced chokehold. He squeezed, cutting off the air, his muscles burning with the effort. Wells thrashed, his expensive shoes drumming on the floor. But Damien held on, his rage a cold, pure, righteous fire. He held on until the struggling weakened, then went limp. Wells's unconscious body slumped to the floor. The cabin was suddenly, shockingly silent. The only sounds, Vanessa sobbing in the corner, the wet, agonized gurgling of Damon Scott, and the low, furious, wet growl of Chief, who still had his jaws locked on Jonah Reed's shattered arm. Damien stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his body screaming. He looked at the chaos. He looked at Vanessa, alive, at Chief, the protector. He was alive. They were alive. The victory was theirs, and theirs alone. The silence was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of Damien and Vanessa, the whimpering of Damon Scott from where he lay bleeding, and the low, satisfied growl of Chief. The cabin, a scene of brutal, close-quarters violence, was a shambles. The door hung by a single splintered hinge, the table was overturned, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Damien released his hold on Adrian Wells. The man's body slumped, unconscious, to the floor next to the groaning Damon Scott. Chief, his jaws still firmly locked on Jonah Reed's shattered arm, gave a final warning snarl before slowly, reluctantly, releasing his grip. Reed, his face a mask of agony, curled into a ball, clutching his mangled limb. Damien moved first to Vanessa. She was still huddled behind the hearth, her body shaking, but her eyes were open, wide and tear-filled, fixed on him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw, his throat aching. She shook her head, a small, choked sob escaping her. No. Just scared. He reached out a hand and she took it, her grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her gently to her feet. His gaze swept the room, taking in the 3 downed men. 2 unconscious, 1 bleeding out. "Chief, stay," he commanded. The dog, his hackles still slightly raised, positioned himself between Vanessa and the defeated men. Damien found some rope from his unpacked rucksack, thin but strong. He tied Wells's hands and feet, then did the same for Reed, ignoring the man's pained grunts. Damon Scott was losing too much blood to be a threat. Damien simply bound his hands and applied a crude tourniquet to his leg wound, stopping the worst of the bleeding. He wasn't a killer, he was a ranger. The mission was complete. He returned to Vanessa. She had a long, shallow scrape on her forearm where Reed had dragged her. He cleaned it with bottled water from his pack and bandaged it carefully. 15 minutes later, the cabin was still. The adrenaline was slowly draining from Damien's body, leaving him utterly exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest. He leaned against the hearth, the shotgun resting against the wall, his eyes on the chaos. Vanessa sat beside him, Chief at her feet, a silent picture of shared survival. They were alive, but they were still trapped. The storm outside had dwindled to a light snowfall, but the trail was impassable, and Wells's men, or at least their cars, were still out there. Then a new sound cut through the wind. It wasn't the distant rumble of the SUVs. It was a deeper, more powerful hum, growing steadily louder. It was the distinct sound of multiple heavy engines, moving fast, purposefully, through the snow. Damien's head snapped up. Chief, who had been resting, sprang to his feet, a low, questioning whine in his throat. The sound swelled, becoming a roaring crescendo. Lights, not the piercing beams of Wells's luxury vehicles, but broader, more utilitarian, began to flood the clearing. "What is it?" Vanessa whispered, her voice laced with fresh fear. Damien moved to the shattered doorway, peering out. What he saw made his breath catch. Several dark, heavily armored tactical vehicles, their imposing forms draped in fresh snow, were swarming into the clearing. They were the kind of vehicles used by federal agencies, not local law enforcement. Men in heavy winter gear, armed with assault rifles, were fanning out, their movements precise and practiced. "FBI," Damien breathed, a wave of profound relief washing over him so intense it almost buckled his knees. He heard shouts from outside, commands being given. A team was already moving toward the ridge. A sharp, distant crack of a rifle shot echoed from the woods. Then, silence. Brett Morgan, the sniper, had been neutralized. A moment later, a figure stepped through the ruined doorway of the cabin. He was a man in his late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately took in the scene. The defeated thugs, the weary ranger, the pregnant woman, the watchful dog. This was Henry Lawson, the FBI agent. He looked at Damien, then at Wells, then at the Zippo lighter still on the table. A slow, grim nod. "Looks like you had a busy night, Mr. Foster." "He murdered my brother," Damien said, his voice flat. "He came for James's data." Lawson knelt beside Wells's unconscious form. "We know James was a good man, and a very smart one. He worked with us for months. He suspected Wells was using his company for money laundering and other, less savory activities." Lawson looked up at Vanessa. "Your call 2 weeks ago was invaluable, Ms. Brooks. It confirmed everything James had told us. We had Wells under surveillance, but we couldn't move until we had definitive proof of his involvement in some international transfers and the physical location of the server drive James had been copying." "So you weren't coming to rescue us," Damien said, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "No, Mr. Foster, we weren't," Lawson replied, his gaze steady. "We were coming to clean up. We were already in position in the region, ready to move in. Your brother's plan was ingenious. He gave us enough information to build a case, but he encrypted the core data, knowing Wells would come for it himself. The blizzard delayed us, but the operation was already in motion. We detected Wells's convoy when it left Missoula. We were coming for him anyway. The FBI agents moved with quiet efficiency, securing the perimeter, apprehending Wells and his remaining men. They found Scott's pistol and Damien's knife. They photographed the scene. As the commotion began to die down, Vanessa suddenly looked up, her eyes wide. "The toy," she whispered. "James said he hid the toy here, the data." Damien, now calm, looked at Chief. The dog was resting at his feet, no longer in threat mode, but still alert, watching the new faces. "Chief," Damien said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Find the toy." The dog's ears twitched. His tail gave a single, tentative wag. He rose, stretched, then walked calmly over to the fireplace. He sniffed at the rough stone hearth, then pawed lightly at a loose hearthstone, brushing away a layer of ash. Damien knelt. The stone was indeed loose. He pulled it free, and in the small, dark cavity beneath, nestled securely, was a small, black USB flash drive. He held it up. It was unassuming, unremarkable, but it held the truth, the proof. Justice for James. He handed it to Henry Lawson. This is what he died for. Lawson took the drive, his expression somber. "He won't be forgotten, Mr. Foster, and Wells will pay for what he did." 6 months later. The harsh Idaho winter had given way to a glorious, vibrant spring. The snow had melted, revealing the forest floor carpeted with new green growth and wildflowers. The cabin was no longer a ruin. It was a home. Damien Foster, leaner but with a renewed light in his eyes, stood on the newly built porch. He wore a worn flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong, capable forearms. The lines of grief around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet, determined peace. The porch was made of fresh, unpainted pine, and beyond it, a small, vibrant garden was just starting to bloom. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. Beside him stood Vanessa Brooks. She looked radiant, healthy, and serene, the terror that had once haunted her eyes replaced by a gentle warmth. She was holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Their newborn son, Ray. He was tiny, perfect, and completely oblivious to the battles that had been fought for his existence. He gurgled softly, his small hand reaching out to grasp Vanessa's finger. Damien reached out and gently stroked Ray's impossibly soft head. This was James's legacy, his redemption. At their feet, sprawling comfortably on the warm, sun-drenched wood of the porch, lay Chief. The old canine, his silver-gray fur gleaming in the spring light, was finally at rest. He was no longer a soldier on patrol. He was a guardian. His head was on his paws, but his intelligent eyes were open, observing the world. He was watchful, as always, but his vigilance now held a different quality, a peaceful, contented protection. He looked at Damien, then at Vanessa, and finally at the tiny bundle in her arms. He gave a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of profound peace. His new family was safe, and he would protect them, always. This story reminds us that even after the most devastating storm, life finds a way to rebuild, often in ways we never expected. True loyalty, like the silent, steady presence of a dog like Chief, isn't just about protection. It's the very foundation of healing and the beginning of a new family. If stories like this, exploring the deep, unbreakable bond between veterans and their loyal companions, resonate with you, we hope you'll subscribe and become part of our community. Your support through likes and shares allows us to continue bringing these tales to life. We would be truly honored if you'd share a thought in the comments below about a moment of loyalty that changed your perspective. The journey doesn't have to end here. Our newest story is waiting for you right now. Just click the video you see on the screen.